The 17th of January, 395 AD. The Emperor Theodosius I dies in Milan of edema, a swelling of the body caused, broadly speaking, by the fact that being Emperor of Rome in the late 4th century was not a particularly restful occupation. He was 50 years old. He had spent his reign fighting barbarians on the frontiers, suppressing usurpers in the interior, and attempting to hold together an entity that was, by this point, somewhat larger than any single human being could reasonably manage. He was the last man to rule the entire Roman Empire. He left it to his two sons. Arcadius, 17, received the east. Honorius, 10, received the west. Neither of them was, by any contemporary account, especially suited to the task. The east survived for another 1,000 years. The west fell to Germanic tribes within 80. The question worth asking is why these outcomes were so different, and whether the split itself caused the decline, or whether the split was simply the moment at which a decline already well underway became impossible to pretend otherwise. This requires some explanation. To understand why Rome split, you first have to understand that it had already split several times, and that nobody at the time considered this particularly unusual. The empire was enormous. At its height, it stretched from Scotland to Mesopotamia, from the Rhine to the Sahara. Running something that large from a single capital with the communications technology of the ancient world was not straightforwardly possible. Emperors had been dividing administrative responsibility for decades before the formal division of 395. The Emperor Diocletian, who came to power in 284 AD, formalized this into a system called the Tetrarchy, 4 emperors governing simultaneously, 2 senior and 2 junior, each responsible for a section of the frontier. The idea was efficiency. Barbarian pressure was increasing on multiple fronts simultaneously, and the empire needed rulers who could be physically present at crisis points rather than marching armies across thousands of miles of road. The Tetrarchy collapsed within 20 years, largely because the 4 emperors could not agree on succession and spent a considerable period fighting each other instead of the barbarians. Constantine eventually reunified the empire under himself in 324, moved the capital to Constantinople, named with characteristic modesty after himself, and died leaving it to his 3 sons, who immediately resumed fighting each other. This was, broadly speaking, the pattern. The Roman Empire's underlying problem was not the split. The split was a symptom. The deeper issue was several centuries of accumulated structural strain, political, military, economic, and demographic, that the empire had been managing with varying degrees of success since at least the 3rd century. The political problem was succession. Rome never developed a stable mechanism for transferring power. The formal theory was that the Senate chose the emperor. The practical reality was that the emperor was whoever the legions decided to support, which meant that changing emperors frequently involved the existing one dying in a manner that was rarely peaceful. In 235 to 284 AD, a period historians call with some understatement the crisis of the 3rd century, Rome had 26 emperors in 50 years. Most of them were assassinated. Several reigned for a matter of weeks. The army had become, in effect, a continuous electoral process conducted with lethal means. Even when emperors died naturally, the question of who followed them was rarely settled peacefully. Sons were the preferred answer, but sons were frequently too young, too inexperienced, or simply unlucky enough to attract a rival's attention before they could consolidate power.
The empire had no equivalent of constitutional succession. Every transition was, to some degree, a crisis. The military problem was the frontier. Rome's borders were long, and the peoples beyond them were not standing still. Germanic tribes, Goths, Vandals, Franks, Alemanni, had been pressing against the Rhine and Danube for generations, initially raiding, eventually settling, eventually demanding to be settled inside the borders as foederati, allied troops fighting for Rome in exchange for land and payment. This was, on its face, a reasonable arrangement. It meant Rome's legions were increasingly composed of the same peoples they had previously been fighting, commanded by officers whose loyalty was to their general rather than to any abstract concept of Roman governance. The economic problem was money. Wars cost money. Frontier defense cost money. The enormous bureaucracy required to administer a multi-continental empire cost money. Rome's solution, repeatedly and disastrously, was to debase the currency, reduce the silver content of coins until the coins were effectively worthless, which produced inflation, which eroded the purchasing power of soldiers' pay, which made recruitment harder, which required more barbarian foederati, which cost more money. The tax burden on remaining Roman citizens, particularly the rural poor, became unsustainable. Many placed themselves voluntarily under the protection of large landowners in exchange for tax relief, trading civic freedom for financial survival, an arrangement that would eventually become the defining feature of medieval Europe. The demographic problem compounded everything else. Plague had reduced the population significantly in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Agricultural productivity had declined in many Western provinces. The urban population that had driven Roman commerce contracted. There were simply fewer Romans to pay taxes, fill legions, and staff the administrative apparatus the empire required to function. This was not a problem that could be solved quickly, or solved the hell within the time frame the empire had available. Population recovery takes generations. The empire did not have generations to spare. Against this backdrop, the split of 395 looks less like a decision and more like an acknowledgement. The eastern half was structurally better positioned. Constantinople sat at the junction of Europe and Asia, controlling the trade routes between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. It was wealthy, defensible, and administratively coherent. The eastern provinces, Greece, Egypt, Syria, Asia Minor, were the most economically productive parts of the empire, with dense urban populations, sophisticated commercial networks, and centuries of administrative infrastructure. The East could afford to pay its armies, maintain its frontier, and buy off troublesome neighbors when fighting them was inconvenient. The West could not. The Western provinces were less economically integrated, less urbanized, and more directly exposed to frontier pressure. The Rhine and Danube frontiers, which the West inherited, were longer and harder to defend than their eastern equivalents. The Western tax base was shrinking precisely when military expenditure was rising. The foederati arrangements that held the frontier together depended on commanders who increasingly operated as independent warlords, governing in the name of an imperial authority they had no particular reason to respect. By the early 4th century, the Western Empire was being governed by a series of barbarian generals operating on behalf of emperors who were children, incompetents, or both. Stilicho, himself of Vandal descent, served as effective regent for the young Honorius and held the West together through military skill and relentless political improvisation, until he was executed in 408 on charges of treason. His death left the frontier arrangements he had maintained in considerable disarray. In 410, Alaric and the Visigoths sacked Rome. The city had not been taken by a foreign enemy in 800 years. The psychological impact was significant. Jerome, writing from Bethlehem, said that the city which had conquered the world had itself been conquered. Augustine of Hippo wrote a 1,200-page theological response to it. The empire did not collapse immediately. These things rarely happen immediately. But the direction was established, and the speed of the subsequent deterioration suggests it had been established for some time. By 455, the Vandals sacked Rome again. By the 460s, the Western emperors controlled, in practical terms, little beyond the city of Ravenna, to which the court had retreated on the reasonable grounds that Ravenna was surrounded by marshes and therefore harder to attack. This was not an entirely dignified position for the rulers of a world empire. The last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, the name combining Rome's founder and its first emperor in a person who would be neither, was deposed in 476 by Odoacer, a Germanic chieftain who saw no particular reason to maintain the fiction of Roman imperial authority in a territory he already controlled. He sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople and asked to be recognized as King of Italy instead. The Eastern emperor, Zeno, complied. It was more convenient than the alternative. The Eastern Empire continued for another 977 years, falling to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, still calling itself Roman, still operating under Roman law, still maintaining a theoretical continuity with the republic founded on the banks of the Tiber merely 1,000 years before Christ. Why did the Roman Empire split? Because it was too large to govern coherently from a single center in an era when information moved at the speed of a horse and armies only slightly faster, with a political system that had never resolved the question of legitimate succession, and an economic model that was consuming itself to pay for its own defense. Because the western half of the empire was poorer, more exposed, and less capable of sustaining the military and administrative apparatus that survival required. And because by the time the formal split occurred, the underlying conditions that made recovery possible in the East and impossible in the West had been in place for the better part of 2 centuries. The split did not cause the fall of the West. The fall of the West was produced by the same accumulated pressures that had made the split necessary, and by the fact that the West happened to be holding the harder half when the pressures finally became unmanageable. Theodosius's 2 sons inherited an empire that was already failing in its western portion and surviving in its eastern one. What the split of 395 determined was not whether the empire would fracture, simply that when it did, the fracture would be permanent. Arcadius died at 31, Honorius died at 39. The Eastern Empire outlived them both by approximately a millennium, which is in retrospect a fairly significant difference in outcome for a single inheritance.